We're going to have a fabulous discussion today. My name is Georgia Court. I'm the proprietor of Bookstore Number One and the founder of PoetryLife, and we are in our 12th year this year of bringing the world's best poets to Sarasota. And this year is no exception. I have to tell you that. But before I introduce our poets, I'd like to recognize some of our sponsors. I'm not going to read the list because I know how boring that is. But we have two special sponsors in the audience, and I'd just like to acknowledge that Lisa Martin, representing UBS, is with us from Cincinnati, Ohio. Lisa, wave. And Joan Lovell, she and her husband have been supporters of this program also since the beginning. And Joan is with us. So wave so we can see who you are. Thank you so much for your support. It means the world because it means we can do this year after year. So thank you so much for that. I want to ask you, while it's on my mind too, to please silence your cell phones, okay? Because we don't need anything that beeps or talks or whatever during the poetry reading, although it could be poetry in itself, I suppose. Once we're done with our discussion, you in the audience will have an opportunity to participate. And a member of the FST staff, I think it's JT, who's in the audience, is going to come around. If you raise your hand and you want to participate after the main discussion is over, we'll give you a cue when we're ready for that. He'll come around and he'll hold the microphone for you. This may be a little different than in the past. Well, actually, he's going to hold the microphone and repeat your question. And the reason it's different than in the past is because of COVID restrictions in theaters now. They can't have audience members speaking directly into the mic. If you think this is strange, that's why it's being done that way. So you'll speak your question, JT will repeat it using the microphone, and then our panel will be able to have a discussion about it. Now today's discussion is focusing on PoetryLife's theme for 2023, which is celebrating heritage. Now, all of us have a unique heritage that our lives are based on. It might be our ethnicity. It might be related to where we grew up. It might be related to our gender. It might be related to the financial circumstances under which we grew up. But we all have this background that we bring into our lives. Poets have a particularly keen way of recognizing heritage, their own heritage, in the poetry they write. And that's what our panel will largely be discussing today. And I do want to point out that heritage, that wide variety of all those heritages, and often it's not just one because a lot of these factors play into it, all of that we all possess, that diversity, if you want to use that word, is what makes our world so rich. So this is something we want to celebrate today. Now, I'm not going to give you the full bio of our poets because it's in your program. You don't need that. But I'm going to give a brief introduction. And as I introduce the poets one at a time, they will come one at a time down the stairs and make their grand entrances and take their seats. First person I'm going to introduce is Martín Espada. He's a National Book Award winner, and he's the author of more than 20 books of poetry. And we're pleased to say he's been with us now for several days working with students in generating new poetry in a series of workshops that he entitles Poetry Like Bread, making new poetry rise. One of our PoetryLife alums, Richard Blanco, who several of you will remember, says about Mr. Espada, his poems continue to define the role of the poet as an emotional historian. Like Whitman, Espada stirs in us an undeniable social consciousness and connectedness. Please welcome Martín Espada to the stage. Also with us is Patricia Jabbeh Wesley. She's been working with students this week as well in workshops where she has focused on finding healing in poetry. She's an award-winning poet from Liberia who is an anti-war and human rights activist. I love these few lines from her poem, When Monrovia Rises, because I think these words can be directed at the entire world in which we live, not just at Monrovia, because we truly do all live in one world. And here are the few lines from that poem. We are all the same after all. Same mother, same father, same root, same country, all of us, branches and limbs of the same oak. Please welcome Patricia Jabbeh Wesley. Philip Terman is also with us. He's a poet who I consider, and I think most of the world considers, to be the poet of the Jewish experience. Phil and I have been friends for many years, and he has been instrumental in really helping me organize this year's PoetryLife, the workshops and the events for the whole weekend. Phil is a lover of his family, his heritage, of his garden, and of poetry. Here are a few lines from one of my favorites of his poems called Garden Chronicle. And the more I sit among the flowers, the roses and the irises and the peonies, the more like a flower I become. And once you've passed through the door of poetry, you can never die in the same way again. Please welcome Philip Terman. Our moderator is going to be Kate Alexander, who most of you know. She is Florida Studio Theater's Associate Director at Large, and she has been helping me present the best in poetry to the Sarasota community since the beginnings in 2012. But that's only a bit of what she does. She shares her talents as actress, director, and she brings the joy of playwriting to thousands of students around the world. Please welcome Kate Alexander. And before we begin our discussion, just to acquaint all of you, give you a taste of the poetry of these three people, each is going to come to the podium and read one poem, and then when they have all given you a nice little taste, the discussion will begin. So first up is Martín Espada.
Buenas tardes. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank Georgia Court, especially. Also like to thank Kate, Patricia, Phil, PoetryLife Poets, and of course the Florida Studio Theater. We are here this afternoon to celebrate heritage. And for me, celebrating heritage means celebrating my father and his work. Francisco Luis Espada, Frank Espada, was born in the mountain town of Utuado, Puerto Rico in 1930, died in Pacifica, California in 2014. He was a community organizer. He was a leader, some would say the leader of the Puerto Rican community in New York during the 1960s. And he was a documentary photographer. He created something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project, photo documentary of the Puerto Rican migration. Not everybody thought this was a good idea. It had never been done before. A very famous photographer by the name of Cornell Kappa said to him, quote, "No one wants to look at pictures of Puerto Ricans, Frank." My father used this statement as motivation, and he would repeat himself in the way that fathers do. You know, when they say the same thing over and over, and you have to act as if you're hearing it for the first time. Cornell Kappa, huh? You know, do you know what he said to me? No, what? No one wants to look at pictures of Puerto Ricans, Frank. Well, my father's photographs are now included in the collections of the Smithsonian Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Library of Congress. You have one of my books. On the cover is a photograph taken by my father, an old union organizer in the Bay Area. I'm going to read a poem from this book. It's on page 76 of your hymnal. It's called Mad Love. When my father died, I wrote a series of poems for him. This was one. This one's about my father, the photographer. Mad Love. I took the title from a 1935 horror movie with Peter Lorre. It's absolutely terrible and ridiculous, and you must see it. There's an epigraph with this poem. I'll bet you can guess what it is. Mad Love. No one wants to look at pictures of Puerto Ricans, Frank. Cornell Kappa. My brother said they harvested his corneas. I imagined the tweezers lifting the corneas from my father's eyes, delicate as the wings of butterflies mounted under glass. I imagined the transplant stitches finer than hair, eyes fluttering awake to the brilliance of an open window. This is not a horror movie. This is not Peter Lorre in Mad Love, the insane and jealous surgeon grafting the hands of a killer onto the forearms of a concert pianist who fumbles with the keys of the piano, flings knives with lethal aim, Moonlight Sonata swept away by lust for homicide, his wife shrieking. The blind will see, like the captain of the slave ship who turned the ship around. Voices in the room will praise the Lord for the miracle, yet the eyes drinking light through my father's eyes will not see the faces in the lens of his camera, faces of the faceless waking in the darkroom. Not the tomato picker with a picket sign on his shoulder that says, Reagan steals from the poor and gives to the rich. Not the fry cook in his fedora staring at air as if he knew he would be stomped to death on the stoop for an empty wallet. Not the poet in a beret grinning at the vision of shoes for all the shoeless people on the earth. Not the dancer hearing the piano tell her to spin and spin again. Not the grave digger and his machete, the bandana that keeps the dust of the dead from coating his tongue. Not the union organizer, spirits floating in the smoke of his victory cigar, not the addict in rehab gazing at herself like a fortune teller gazing at the cards, not the face half hidden by the star in the Puerto Rican flag, the darkness of his dissident's eye. Now that my father cannot speak, they wait their turn to testify in his defense, witnesses to the mad love that drove him to it. Thank you.
I didn't know he was taller than me. I'm an immigrant, a former war refugee, survived the Liberian Civil War, walked on the dead to come here with my family, survived torture, and I'm still writing about it. Page 49 is where I'm reading from, When the Wanderers Come Home. Written about going back to my home, original home country of Liberia, and discovering that I was neither African, nor American, nor Liberian, nor anything, because I had become somebody else. Even Liberians don't think I am Liberian anymore. This poem is entitled In My Dream. In my dream, I'm on the road, flying somewhere, stranded at an airport. I've lost my car or lost the keys in my lost purse. Or I'm in the airport security line without my passport, a lone stranger without a country. So they want to know my country. They want to know my place of birth. They want to know the map that got me lost. They want to know the name of those who shattered my dream, shattered my lost country. So I say, I'm a woman looking for home, displaced, a bag of useless goods for my journey, a flip-flap, a ragged bundle that only the refugee carries. I'm the lost and unfound from those who did not come on boats, those that did not come ticketed in chains, those who did not fit in chains, those neither welcomed by those who came on boats nor in chains. I'm among the newcomers, newcomers, those who came ticketed not by plane tickets or train tickets, those who came ticketed by live bullets, grenades, and rocket missiles, those still bleeding from their sides, those who found their way here by crawling among the dead.
I want to also thank Georgia and fellow poets who I greatly admire, Martín and Patricia. This poem might require some. The interesting thing about writing about heritage is that not everybody understands everybody's heritage, and so the wonderful thing is that it's the Latin poet Horace said that poetry is meant to entertain and inform and educate. So this is a poem that uses some references that some of you may know and some of you may not. So it's called A Minyan Plus One. And a minyan is for a Jewish service to take place, 10 adults that have been bar or bat mitzvahed need to be present in the traditional Jewish service. And some of you may know the story of Abraham arguing with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham said, if there's 50, would you destroy it? 40, 30, and 10. If there's less than 10, it was okay to destroy it. A Jewish service has a reading from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that is the main text. And each week there's a portion of the Torah that's read until we read the whole Torah over the year, and then we start again, as if we didn't read it before. So for a couple thousand years we're reading the Torah over and over again every year until we get it right, I suppose. So that's meant to be a Jewish joke. So this commemorates the Tree of Life catastrophe that happened October 27th, 2018. It's called a minion plus 1. So a minion is 10. And whenever, it's like after a service, you see somebody who wasn't there and you say, did you get a minion? Did you get a minion? Were you able to have a service? And if you have like more than 10, you'd say a minion plus 1, even if you have 5 more or something. It's called a minion plus 1. A minion plus 1 was taken from us on the Shabbat, the most joyous of holidays, the only holy day even God himself celebrates, the emulation of Eden, the day of completion. Before they could perform the service, before they could take their seats and begin the prayers, before the ark opened and the Torah revealed, before they could rise and sway and chant their portion, the book opened like wings in their steady hands, though they know the blessings by heart. I didn't know them, but I knew them. In the way we know those raised, no matter where we originated, in the same beliefs our ancestors inherited, all the way back into those mysterious origins, those stories of creation and exile, of miracles and complicated kings, of commandments and wisdoms, welcome the stranger, spread across the millennium. We suffer the same persecutions, celebrate the same triumphs, chant in the same order the blessings, holiday after holiday, generation after generation, Torah portion after Torah portion. Before that week's Torah portion, a minion plus 1 was taken. When they would have once again heard the story of when Abraham, our first patriarch of chutzpah, approached and argued with the Lord, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" And God answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And so, as on other days, on that day, he did. He allowed the wicked to sweep away the righteous. And when the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left and took a minion plus 1. And Abraham returned home.
Thanks, JT. Welcome. 3 distinct heritages, 3 very different people. So we hope to delve into that, and as Georgia said, part 1, we'll be exploring our conversation together, and then we will move to questions at about halfway through and continue the conversation. So, Patricia, I'd like to start with you, and I will ask each one. You touched on your heritage as you began that most profound piece. Can you expand on how you got here? How did you leave? She'll control it up there. Yeah.
I came to the United States with my husband and 3 small children. oldest was 6+ years old, and a 1-month-old, 1-year-old baby who has survived part of the war. But we're in a war about close to 2 years, so he was almost 2. We had studied in the United States. In our 20s, we attended Indiana University in Bloomington, and I got a master's in English education. So America was familiar. We had also brought American missionaries, because we were Christian workers and university professors. So we would bring these Americans to, were coordinating their visits, and about 25 students straight out of high school and partly in college, and 4 staff will come to our country between 87 and 89. And so we were familiar with Americans. I would have them in my home for like 6 weeks of the summer, 2 Americans in my home. And boy, if you have an American in your home and you fix breakfast, you have to fix everything. If you're fixing everything, because Americans eat everything, so many things. Okay? So we were familiar with Americans, but these people were the ones that fought to get us out of the war. We experienced the Civil War, and Charles Taylor, you've probably heard of, invaded the country and overran the country, including this capital city. We're in a suburb. And by the time bombs were falling behind our house, our home, and people's homes were exploding around us, on August 1, 1990, we packed up our things that we thought we needed and fled into the countryside and stayed in a displaced center for a long time. And then those very friends fought to get us out of the war, so we arrived here in 1991. And that's how we ended up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And even as I speak to you, the woman we lived with for 5 years is in her final days, dying of cancer right now. And so that's my heritage. I'm Grable. In Grable, we say, "Na we yo, na fede yo, hello, how are you?" So heritage influences my writing, not just my indigenous heritage or my Africanness or my oral tradition from my mother. It influences my life, but also the trauma that I saw, the people I saw them execute, the girls I saw raped, the government I saw topple, the wars that are killing people around the world. All of that is my heritage. They're all my heritage, and that's what I write about, and that's how important that heritage that I gather. And part of my heritage is Michigan, where we first lived. And America is also my heritage. America belongs to me now, after 30 years.
Martín, could you expand a little bit on your heritage? I know you started with your dad. But
Okay. I am originally from the tropical paradise of Brooklyn, New York. I am from the East New York section of Brooklyn. I grew up there in the Linden Projects. And, I grew up with the idea that Puerto Rico was paradise. That's because it was paradise compared to Brooklyn, at least in our heads. And so I visited for the first time when I was 11 years old. Been back many times since, but that first time, of course, is always unique and unforgettable, as it was. I grew up speaking English as a first language, Spanish as a second language. Again, this was Brooklyn, and there are some parts of Brooklyn where English is still spoken. So that was, I was always searching for myself. And in the process of searching for myself, poetry is an excellent way of doing that, but I searched for myself in every way I could. Oftentimes, it was a matter of simply looking around me. And for me, being Boricua, being Puerto Rican, was absolutely inseparable from my father's activism. I grew up with an ethos of resistance all around me. Right, so the photographs were hanging on the walls in the apartment, but also on the walls of my imagination. At the same time, out in the street, there were riots. Out on the street, there were fires. Out on the street, there was crime. And when I was 9 years old, I went to my first demonstration. It was organized by my father. It was organized around the murder of a man I referenced in the poem you just heard. His name was Agropino Bonillo. Agropino Bonillo was a short order cook with 10 kids. And he was walking home one night on Alabama Avenue, if you know Brooklyn. And he was surrounded by drug addicts who demanded money from him. And when he said he did not have any money, he was stomped to death. And so my father, in cooperation with local clergy, organized a candlelight march and vigil, all about creating a sense of community in that community that was under siege. And I remember very well that we started walking. I'm 9 years old, so I have a rough idea what's going on. I was with my mother, my brother, my sister, my father was at the head of the line, and we all had candles, and it was raining. And the rain kept snuffing out the candles. And every time the rain snuffed out the candles, people would gather in circles and light the candles again. And the candles will go out again, and we'd light the candles again. They go out again, and we light them again, and keep raining. We started with about 100 or so people at the beginning of this march. Now, mind you, we're marching down Alabama Avenue towards the site of the murder and this blood-stained stoop where there was a box with people drawing money for the family. As we got closer to that site, people saw us walking down the street with the candles, and they began to join us from the buildings on the left and on the right. They started coming down the steps with their own candles. And then the sun set, and there was darkness all around us. And all I could see on either side was the light of those candles bobbing down the steps as they joined us. And the march, which started with approximately 100 people, grew to more than 3,000 as people poured out of those buildings to join us in the street because they all knew why we were there. And we got to that place, and I remember that wooden box on the bloodstained stoop, and my mother crying, throwing coins into the box, my father and other political leaders making speeches, and most of it going over my head. But there were the candles. There was the rain. There was the night. There was the community. That I never forgot. And that became a poem many years later called The Moon Shatters on Alabama Avenue. And my father, who would never come right out and say, good poem, took that poem and framed it and put it on the wall next to the photographs in his exhibits. And so it came full circle in that way. And so my heritage is that too. My heritage is a heritage of resistance, it's a heritage of activism, it's a heritage of struggle, inseparable from the Puerto Rican or Latino experience in the United States.
Would you say, as a follow-up, that is how poetry found you in that kind of baptismal experience?
Oh, wow, it's a completely different story.
How did poetry find you?
Wow. Okay, well, I have a superhero origin story. I was 15, and by that point in time, had left Brooklyn for a place called Valley Stream, Long Island. This was in the mid-1970s. We were unaware, dopes that we were, that at the same time there was a social phenomenon in New York City called white flight. There were people leaving the city to get away from African Americans and Puerto Ricans, to get away from us. No one told us. And so we arrived in a community, Valley Stream, Long Island, that was quite hostile to our presence. The only Puerto Rican family in town. And so I was, I was alienated. And one day I was sitting in the back of the room. It was 10th grade. I was sitting with all the other young thugs. And my teacher, Mr. Valeka, I don't know his first name, Mr. He came up to us and said, "Young thugs, I have an assignment for you." And he held up a copy of the New Yorker magazine. Now, we were all New Yorkers, but this was a very different New York. And he said, I want you, young thugs, to make your own version of the New Yorker magazine. See, it's got sections. So everybody take a section. Everybody going to create their own New Yorker magazine right now. Go. And so we passed the magazine from hand to hand down the hierarchy of thuggery. And, came the first guy, the biggest, toughest guys that saw the movie reviews. He said, "Oh, movies. I like movies." And he became our film critic. And so I was at the bottom of the food chain. And the only thing left at the end of the magazine was, yes, a poem. He got there first. And I was very upset. I think, oh man, a poem. But I did not want to flunk English again. I was a terrible student, by the way. I failed English in the 8th grade. I failed typing. I failed gym. How do you fail gym? You don't show up. But I didn't want to flunk anymore. So I sat at the back of the room and I wrote a poem. I was sitting by the window, it was raining. So I actually wrote a poem about rain. I don't have the poem anymore. I did not know it would be historically significant. I only remember one line. Tiny silver hammers pounding the earth to describe rain. I had just created my first metaphor. I did not know what a metaphor was. Somebody told me, and then I went strutting down the hallway. I made a metaphor. I'm bad. But I discovered something that day. I discovered that I loved words. I discovered I loved banging words into each other and watching them spin around the room and jump out the window with the rain. And I discovered from the beginning I had something to say with all those words, to write about the place I came from and the places where I was going. And sure enough, history being what it is, this past November, I had a poem in the New Yorker magazine.
Full circle again. Continue a life of full circles. Philip.
Just want to continue to hear Martine talk. I interviewed my mother once about her life, and I had a cassette player, remember those? And I wanted to tape her story, because we had these portraits, my mother's grandparents, and they were very Jewish, observant, seemingly. They have the woman, her grandmother had a babushka, my grandfather They had the long sideburns, and they were looking straight ahead, and they looked old, but I'm sure they were a lot younger than I am now, from Russia, and they never came over. And I wanted to know what the story of those photographs were. That's what it started like. And she didn't hesitate to want to be interviewed. She wrote poetry herself, and didn't mind talking about her life. And she said something that has always stayed with me. I said, what about being Jewish? How did that happen? She said, we breathed, we were Jewish. And it was so much a part of her life, and so much a part of her, the center of her life. And when I was very, very young, and this is true with my older brothers as well, we had to say the most important prayer in the Jewish service. It's the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And we said that every night, and then kissed my mother on the cheek and went to bed. And there was something about those words, and saying the words, and kissing my mother, and going to bed. That ritual. And then going, you rebel against going to a formal service when you're a kid. You just want to leave. You don't understand the Hebrew. But there was something about it that was sacred to me, or something power. I guess has to do with power. It was very powerful. It was powerful when the cantor was singing. It was powerful when the rabbi was intoning the prayers and the blessings and talking about stories from the Bible. And I love stories. And I fell in love with the stories of Jacob and Esau because I had brothers who were twins. And they always fought. And Abraham, how cool is that? Here he gets this message and leave your home, and he did. That's pretty brave, So these stories were just incredible, as I think we all know. And to a kid that liked stories and who kind of likes to dabble with words, that was a powerful force. And then my mother also wrote poetry, and she had a desk, kind of a table in the den. And my father, it wasn't really a den until it was a porch. My father renovated it in his way and became a den. And next to the TV, she had her typewriter, and she would go over there and type and write poems, and she would read them at weddings or bar mitzvahs and occasions like that. And they made an impact on me, just the language and this notion of God. What was that, and this notion of being kind of like Moses. I had I think that a lot of this has to do with personal connections. Moses had a speech impediment. God said to Moses, go tell the people this. Free my people. Let them go. Tell them I want Pharaoh to let them go. And Moses totally resisted. The Jews were terrible. They resisted everything. They had to be really argued into it. And Moses said, I can't, because I have slow speech and of a slow tongue. And so God said, well, then your brother Aaron, what about him? He can speak for the people, right? And Moses said, oh yeah, right, I forgot about him. And so Arab spoke for the people, but Moses had a speech impediment, and I, coincidentally, had a speech impediment. And I thought, oh, wow, that's good. Even Moses, had a speech impediment. That's interesting, So I saw a lot of myself in a lot of the stories and in a lot of the characters. But there's also what I was interested in. I learned that Israel means wrestling with God. And in the poem I read, I wrestle with God. And one could say I accuse God of taking 11 Jews from the tree of life. Yet we also love God, and we hate him, and we're angry with him, and we're stubborn with him, but he's still there, or she is still there. And so I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think what I'm saying is that Judaism in every single facet is what, in the human facet, in that God being human, we're made in God's image, has just, I've just absorbed it, and it's saturated my life because of some of those reasons.
Well, I think what you're all saying is that you didn't escape your life. So many people want to escape, but you actually delved into, you drew from the images, from the soil of everything you came from. Nobody is talking about, a diaspora is different, but we're not talking about escape, we're talking about that wealth of where you come from.
Well, I did want to escape Judaism often, but that's also part of being Jewish, I learned. I fell in love with Kafka, Kafka's writing. Kafka never wanted, he was very Jewish, but he never mentioned the word Jew in his stories, But then, the notion of, I said, well, there's a form of alienation, and Jews were kind of alienated as well. So it's part of being Jewish, which is, you can't get around it. Anyway.
Patricia, I didn't get to ask you how poetry found you.
Mike.
Yes, you do.
I'm used to being a mom. If you're a mom, you can call your child 1 mile away. I was a storyteller as a child, and my grandfather used to like me telling stories because for some reason he knew I was growing up in the city, and when I was 11, my father sent us to our home village, and according to him, he sent us there so we would get to know our heritage and speak our language, because when you're in Monrovia, which was named after your president, James Monroe, okay? Monrovia, you were in a melting pot, so you have all these language groups, 20 languages from our country, and so you never really learn much. So he sent us in the village. But I think he sent us there because he had a lot of child custody issues, and he was trying to pretend he was sending us to learn our language. But through that, I got to know my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, and he would always, when something happened, it was village life, okay? So we'll go to the creek. I had to learn village life from scratch. And we'll go to the creek, and somebody will fall, and my cousins would say, he fell in the water. And then he fell in the water. And then he would say, come, baby, come. You can tell it better. And I would tell them, we're walking and we're twisting, and the trees were there, and the birds were there, and the birds were chirping on the trees. And so he always said, the only person who can tell a story is her. So he in Africa, they have a culture. So when I was, before he died, one morning, it was my time for blessing. And so he didn't care if we had priests or pastors. So they would say you on the threshold, and they will have a cup of water, and he would, sip the water, have a lot of water in his mouth, and then he would spill it on you from his mouth, and then he would tell you your blessing for your life. And at that time, he told me I would write books. I would be very educated. I would be the most educated in the Jabbeh family. I would write many books, and I would go far. And my cousins laugh about that, okay? So I was 11. Then when I was sent back to the city at 13, my father would throw his English books at me, and England in literature, American literature books, he would toss them at me because I used to like reading. And I would read. He gave me his French history books. I discovered that they killed Marie Antoinette. And all those things, I started reading Shakespeare, and when I was 13. And so one day, I'm reading Donne and Browning, and I loved the poetry. So one day, when my father came from work, my father was working with USAID. He was very educated, so he worked with USAID. So when he came from work one day, I had spent a whole week copying Donne and Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry, part of Shakespeare's poetry, in a thing, what I call a book. And then I put on the title, I stapled it together, I put the title, Poems by Patricia Jabbeh. So when he came from work and he was eating, I told him I had a presentation to make. I had a book, I had published a book. And I was about 13, 14. And then I read, he told me to read, and I read the first poem. He had graduated from school 1958, and we're talking about 1970-something, So he looked at me funny. And then I read a second poem. I was reading a second poem. He said, hold it. come here, you little skinny thing. You didn't write this poem. These are British poets, and you cannot steal people's work. I said, I wrote it. I said, when you were at work, I wrote them. I wrote it from the book. It's my poems. So he said, get my belt. I'm going to whip this woman if she doesn't tell me the truth. So I confessed. So he said, now you go in that corner and sit there and write me a poem from your head. If you don't write a poem from your head, I'm going to whip you with this belt. I wrote my first poem. And my father listened to me reading the poem, and he was jumping up. He was my first fan. And when I wrote a poem, my father would give me money. Then I started writing stories, and I would be 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm writing. So when he found out I was struggling to write with hand, he said to me, he said, oh, you're really going to be a writer. So you know what I'm going to do? You're 14, I'm going to help you. So he bought me a big typewriter. I couldn't type. I said, how am I going to do it? He said, you're going to learn how to type. He bought me a Greg typing book. I've never forgotten the name of that typing book. And it teaches you self-teaching. ASDF, and my father was a terrible teacher. So he said, I'm not going to teach you, you're going to teach yourself. You're going to learn how to type in 1 month. If you learn how to type in 1 month, I'm going to test you on this date. If you fail, I'm going to whip you. You understand? So I learned how to type. I got to the place, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. I did all of that. In 1 month, my father came to test me. I said, I haven't got the numbers yet. He said, you didn't say you want to be a mathematician. You want to be a writer. You don't need numbers. So that's how I started writing poetry. And my father was my biggest fan. When he found my poem, even if I did anything terrible, if I beat the little kids, if I told him I was writing a poem and they were causing a lot of noise, that's why I beat him. He said, she wrote a poem. She wrote a poem, and that's how I started writing poetry. He was always my fan. He's there now, but that's how I discovered I was a poet.
I love your poem about the stepmother telling you to be quiet.
Oh. My stepmother, I always like to have a disclaimer. Not everybody is a terrible stepmother. But in Africa, we have a lot of terrible stepmothers. And the reason we do is because children don't have protection. Nobody enforces the law. And so some women become gold diggers and marry rich people. My mother got pregnant with me before this woman married my mother. My father took my mother out of school, and then he went on to college. In those days, you got pregnant, you were done, okay? And so my mother never went back to school. She was very poor. My father found this woman. She was very abusive. She was abusive not just to us, the stepchildren. She was abusive to her own nieces and nephews. And she was childless, and so she was frustrated. But to tell you the truth, she hated me for over 30 years. But by the time the war came, I loved her all my life. And I remember in the war, she made a turnaround. She walked through bullets to bring us food. And when she was dying, I was in America. I used to send her things. We were still struggling. She died in 93. And they said before she died, she sent for my mom. And I'm saying this because she was cruel and evil, because she was childless. And in Africa, you have to have a child. But also because maybe she didn't know love. But it was interesting that I showed her love. And when she was dying, they said she got the things I sent her. They told her, because she was bedridden, she had a stroke during the war and the bombing. She had a stroke. They had a lot of properties. So she went to one of the properties in the city. And that's where she got a stroke and she was bedridden. So she said she wanted to put the things I sent her on her. And she sent for my mom. And they took her arm because she couldn't move her arm. And they put them on my mom's head. And she blessed me. And she said I was the only child who ever cared for her. And that I would be blessed. I think it's because of that I'm sitting on this stage tonight. So she was so say that. But she used to always tell me to shut up. And if you live around me, you will tell me to shut up. So she always used to say, shut up, Marie, shut up. And one day something will shut your mouth. And she told me, man, that's what the poem was about. And nobody has ever been able to shut me up, even my husband.
Before we go to questions, I do want to ask you one more thing, and that is, all of you have been touched by censorship in some way, whether in your country or... So I'd like each one of you, maybe, Martín, do you want to start and let us know how that is, as we're facing that in our community. So we'd love to hear how that has been for you.
The other day, somebody asked me about being censored, and I said, which time? And we had to narrow it down. There have been a few incidents. I go, this is nothing new, as you're well aware. And many of the political and social issues that trigger censorship today always did. Immigration being one good example. And so I can recall doing a reading in Tucson, Arizona for an organization that monitored human rights abuses on the border. It was a benefit at a bookstore. And I got up there to start my reading. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. I opened my mouth, and somebody else's voice came out. It was a loudspeaker over my left shoulder. And this voice said, "Would everyone please leave the building? We have just received a bomb threat." And so there was this movement. I never saw people move so fast in my life. This was like a fire drill on speed. And so we got out to the parking lot, and we fully expected to be going back in the building in 10 minutes. Nothing of the kind occurred. In fact, what happened instead was that the Tucson police showed up. They brought their bomb-sniffing dogs. I didn't know that Tucson had bomb-sniffing dogs. They had invested in bomb-sniffing dogs. They sealed off the building, which meant we couldn't go back in, we couldn't get the podium, we couldn't get the mic, we couldn't get the books, we couldn't get the chairs. So we did the reading under a street lamp. I stood under a street lamp as night fell, and the audience stood around me in the empty parking lots, the empty parking spaces. So I guess you might say by definition I got a standing ovation. And then the 10 o'clock news showed up live. Somebody called them, and we did a feature. We were the lead story in the 10 o'clock news. And it feels like in the moment you have won, that censorship has boomeranged in the way you always hear about. And now many more people had seen and heard us than otherwise would have. And yet I got back to my hotel room, I woke up about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, wait a minute, somebody just threatened to kill me for poetry. And I thought that was an overreaction. I've heard of bad reviews, but this is ridiculous. And so even that victory, though it may have been, was not a victory in the broadest sense. Later, I would be censored in Arizona even more explicitly because my book, Zapata's Disciple, a collection of essays and poems, was part of the curriculum of the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson that was outlawed by statute in the state of Arizona in 2012. And I joined this roll of honor, all these banned books, and along with the Mexican American authors you would expect in such a curriculum, like Sandra Cisneros, like Ana Castillo, like Jimmy Santiago Vaca. There was also Henry David Thoreau. There was James Baldwin. There was Howard Zinn. There was and there was Jonathan Kozol. And there I was in this company. Oh yes, there was also Shakespeare and The Tempest. So there was this outcry, first of all, about Shakespeare and The Tempest, and even in Arizona, they are capable of embarrassment, and so they unbanned The Tempest and left the rest of us banned. And so this case made its way through the courts. And in point of fact, you cannot pass and enact any legislation that targets one particular group of people. That is discriminatory. You're violating the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, among other things. And so, ultimately, they prevailed in court, but not until that program had been destroyed. And the people around that program had been destroyed. Not just the faculty who lost their jobs, but those students who had to watch people from the authorities march into their classrooms, box up their books, march out with those boxes, and even remove a Mayan calendar from the wall. And so that, it used to be said that if democracy, I believe this is the saying, if democracy is a laboratory, Arizona is where they're making meth. But everything they did in 2012 is now happening again in Florida, and what the common ground is that it's out in the open. Censorship, in my experience, always had two characteristics. One, it was, for the most part, in secret. It was behind closed doors. It was, the corroded machinery operated behind a curtain. Secondly, sadly, censorship works. The books about this disciple that I was talking about actually went out of print when South End Press, the publisher, went belly up, not long after that. And for years and years, it was not available. It was then reprinted precisely because it was on this list of banned books by Northwestern University Press, and that's now where you can find it, with a new introduction I wrote outlining the censorship case. But it must be said that censorship works. And sometimes it's censorship by attrition. Most of the time, when a poet dies, the work dies with the poet. My apologies to the poets in the audience. That happens to be the truth. And if you don't believe me, go into any used bookstore and stand in the poetry section and ask yourself how many of those names you recognize, right? And so, we have to fight back. We have to push back. They are, strangely enough, at times they can be outmaneuvered. At times they are capable of embarrassment. And I'll just cite something that a situation you're all aware of. The children's book about Roberto Clemente. And that was pulled off the shelf. And there was such a national outcry that they were embarrassed and they made the book available again, right? We have that power, right? The message we constantly receive, especially when we are not in control of our government, is that we are powerless, right? We are helpless. There's nothing we can do. We passively accept whatever is put upon our heads. In point of fact, that is a myth they want you to internalize. That's what they want you to, the coffee they want you to drink at breakfast. If you organize yourselves and if you make yourselves heard, right? They can pick you off one by one. But if you're organized, it's much more difficult to retaliate against you. And you can make a loud enough noise that you can embarrass them, and you can make them take a course other than the one they have dictated to you. The authoritarians come and go. We stay here.
And I do want to get to questions, but Patricia, can you just speak to that as well?
Well, I think black people are censored. Am I lying? Black literature is censored. How many of you study any black literature really seriously in college? Not really. We don't study enough black literature. So I know censorship is not just about now, where they are banning black writers' books. I know if I talk about censorship in my country, original country, I have another book that just came out last January, this year. People are already calling me and cussing me up for the introduction. In Liberia, there is no major writer who has ever been produced by the Republic of Liberia, the oldest African republic. This is it before you. Me, and I'm not boasting, I am the Chinua Achebe of Liberia. I grew up thinking I would do all I could to be the Liberian writer everybody would read. My books are taught all over the world. Ghanaians travel across the world to present on me. Nigerian scholars have book chapters about me. In my country, my books are not being taught in my country. You people talk about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf when she was president. Every time I went back to Liberia to do workshops with young writers on my own money, I got an appointment with her. I would get a call by the protocol, the president wants to see you. I would go and she would say, what can I do for you? What do you want to do? When are you coming home? The job's here. And I would say, thank you very much. I have a job at Penn State. I'm a professor, and Penn State gave me money to come and do my research. That's why I'm here. I'm not looking for work. When are you going to have them teach the books that explore Liberian life, Liberian poetry, Liberian culture? Because I write about the war that they supported, that killed 500,000 people in the line and say, well, 250,000 people. For 14 years, you kill people for 14 years, and the UN wants to tell me, well, 250,000 people? And send over 1.5 million to exile. So I am banned in my country. I was in Ghana last year for a poetry festival. The Ghanaian people, the Center for the West Africa Examination Council is in Ghana. They don't understand why nobody has recommended the teaching of my books. Because all of the West African schools have to take the same exam to pass. So I am banned in my country, silently banned. And in America, I've had people say my poetry isn't American poetry. I am American. My voice is American. I see through my lenses, but I'm American too. And yet, people used to say, you got to stop writing Africa now. You got to write American poetry because you are no longer in Africa. I'm like, I'm going to write what is mine. And it has to be go, okay? So yes, we are silently banned. I live in a town where I try to read in the library. My friends have read there. My fellow poets have read there. Nobody will invite me to read at the library. I go there and put my name down. Nobody will let me read in my library. Being black is a ban. I must tell you. If you get banned just by being black or color. And then, so they don't even know what you're writing anyway, because they're not reading it. So yes, censorship is here. It's been here a long time. Like somebody once said, people say, there was a lot of talk about how Americans are now struggling. It's so terrible now. It used to be good. It used to be good. Then some black activists said, when was it good? It's always been bad for us. Come join us. So censorship has been here a long time. When I did a PhD, I have a PhD in English. In my university, there was no teaching of black American authors. You had to go and do Africana studies. You had to go to the African Studies Department to study black literature. So you know how I studied black literature? I asked a professor to help me do independent study. So for a year, I studied black American literature because I knew if I got a PhD and I only knew white literature, I was a stupid fool. So I studied black literature independently. And part of my project was the connection between Lucille Clifton and the Kenyan writer Okok Petit, and how African oral tradition influences black literature. Because we had to do a creative dissertation and a scholarly dissertation. And then when I took the PhD exam, then they designed the exam, and they gave me a question from black literature. And so I told the director, are you crazy? You didn't teach anybody black literature, so you profiled me for black literature exam. I said, if you try it and you fail me, you will know. They had to apologize. So we are censored. It's coming. After they get rid of black literature, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, they're coming. They're coming for everybody. They're coming for everybody. I know they censored Walt Whitman a long time ago, but you don't know that. People don't teach Walt Whitman. I teach Walt Whitman. Because as much as crazy as it was, Walt Whitman was talking about the things that we talk about today in the 1800s. Censorship is here, and we got to fight it. We got to find our own publishers. We got to teach our children. We have to have independent study, independent teaching. I am ready to do an independent course in African American literature if you want me to. Because we got to teach. If your children don't like black literature and they come into my class in college, thank goodness I will soon retire, you will know that your children should have learned black literature. Black American literature is American literature. Hispanic literature is American literature. American white literature is American literature. Jewish literature is American literature. Thank you.
I'll be brief. Just a couple things. I haven't experienced censorship in my own poetry in the United States, but I've been connected with some censorship and in other ways through poetry. The first thing is this is sort of the main thing. I have a wonderful friendship with a writer in Aleppo named Saleh Razak. And he saw one of my poems on the internet, and he translated it, and we became friends. And then we worked on, he wanted to translate poems from Arabic, which I don't know, into English, and I helped him with that. And this was during the Trump era. And Syria was one of the 7 banned countries, as you recall, from coming in. You couldn't, if you were Syrian, or you couldn't come into the country. So there was a journal in California by the name of Poetry International that the editor is Ilya Kaminsky, a wonderful poet, who wanted to publish poems by poets from the 7 banned countries. And he knew about my project with my Aleppo friend, and my Aleppo friend was having, you can imagine the conditions he was living in. His son was missing, he was bombs all the time, destroying the city. And the fact that I had this relationship with him was kind of miraculous. But we were emailing every day about literature and about translation and about poetry. And so he asked, Ilya Kaminsky asked me if I would work with Saleh for some Syrian poets that would be published in Poetry International. And Saleh and he sent me translations into English of Syrian poets. I helped him with the translations, and they were published in Poetry International, which is wonderful because that was when Syrians couldn't come in, but the poetry apparently can come in. The other thing is that I wanted to send Saleh my new book of poetry, and so he gave me the address, sent me the address, and I mailed it. And the book was called The Torah Garden. Not long after that I sent it, the envelope came back without the book. And so I talked, first of all, I was always wondering about emailing with Saleh because are we allowed to even email each other? You know, I mean, but it doesn't seem, I think the country was in such chaos that they didn't worry about that stuff. Too chaotic and confusing. So we were able to have this underground email exchange. But Saleh said, well, the title, The Torah Garden, probably was not welcome in Syria. And then I thought, well, Jews, of course, in Syria and Arab countries probably have difficult time. But of course, Palestinians and Arabs have a difficult time in Israel as well. And I know that there are poets, Arabic Palestinian poets in Israel that are banned. I just think it's an incredibly terrible, horrible thing that keeps people apart within this country, but also internationally. So when I think about Israel and the Jewish-Palestinian relationship and the Arab-Jewish relationship, Saleh and I were able to have that, and are still able to, I got an email from him today, still able to have this incredible friendship between Arab and Jew, between Muslim and Arab and Syrian and American enemies, Arab and Jew enemies, but here we are friends. Yet nevertheless, many extreme both sides don't want to read each other's work, don't want to read each other's poetry. And so that's kind of my connection with censorship, I guess, and the notion of how terrible it is and what an obstruction it is for peace and resolution.
Thank you. We have Judge Williams with us in the audience. And Judge, I just want to ask you to wrap this little section up with just a statement of where censorship is in our community. I'm going to give you my mic.
I didn't know that was coming. One of the things I do is I am the executive, not the executive director, but I'm the chair of the board of directors of Embracing Our Differences. And as you know, we have a Bayfront exhibit that's dedicated to portraits expressing diversity, and the banning of our portraits has been in the news. State College of Florida felt that it was inappropriate. Basically, language dealing with diversity and inclusion included within the exhibit was banned. So instead of self-banning certain portions of our exhibit, we decided to take the whole exhibit away from State College of Florida because we could not, based on our ethics, allow ourselves to be banned. So that's where we are. The good news is, even though our exhibit was vandalized here at Bayfront Park, we had a great outpouring of support. Many people who normally wouldn't donate to our organization did. And it is now going to be on display in South County in Northport, so you'll have a chance to see it down there. So it is active here in our community. It is something that, again, is present currently, but we are fighting, and hopefully all of you understand how important it is for us to express ourselves without worrying about being banned. So with that, I will give it back to Kate to close out.
And we do have to thank Bookstore One because of it's one of the few places of free thought in this city when books are being banned everywhere. So thank you, Georgia. We have time for just a few questions. So please make your questions succinct. JT will come over. He's got his mic and he'll repeat it, or I will repeat it. Yes.
So, very similar theme.
Theme through what she's hearing through everyone is the theme of exile. Would anyone like to address that?
Well, I'm the only exile, geographically exiled, okay? I never wanted, I don't hate America, please. I love America. I never planned to live in America. I came to grad school in America in 1983. I finished my exams. On Tuesday, I was in Africa by Friday, the same week, okay, after I completed, because I wanted to raise my children in Africa. We built a home and we planted everything, so we know America has all the beauty. You know, a lot of people think everybody comes here because of economic blessing and because America is the only country. No, I didn't want to live in America. And then the Civil War drove me out and killed so many of my people. I walked among the dead. It's not metaphoric. And after struggling for 2 years and losing people, we decided we had to exile ourselves. They were killing educated people, they were killing, we survived all kinds of torture. So I read about exile. But the reason I read about exile and this is because I want to keep the voices of those who have died alive. I want to witness to the world that war isn't good. War isn't good, and nobody wins a war. If you read my books, you will see there are no winners in every war. There are no winners. Nobody won the Iraqi war. Nobody won the Vietnam war. Nobody will win the war in Ukraine. Nobody. As long as we are dead and we send millions into exile and we have to feed them, and you have millions of Ukrainians fleeing to Poland, nobody is winning the war. And that's what I'm living for, to talk about how exile destroys everyone.
Thank you. We'll take another question. Are poets exiles? I know we have the diaspora.
I'll have to say that the rise of there's a rise of anti-Semitism in this country. I think we all know that. And my wife and I and children are members of a small synagogue, very small, and getting smaller because in rural, small town America, people are leaving, they're not moving in. So, but our synagogue is still hanging on, and we have a security guard for every event that we have, every service, etc. And when I think of exile, I don't necessarily think of exile from Israel. I think of just being alone. Yes. Just being alone. And we value our synagogue very highly because, not just because of the security, but because of the community. And we value every member. There are not very many. And whenever we get a new member, we're like, wow, fantastic. You know, you're so welcome. Everybody's so welcome. And that's what I think of when I think about exile. We have a community of fellow Jews who are open to each other and help each other during anti-Semitism, but also in joyful ways, in holidays and everything else.
Martin, anything on exile before we close out?
Oh, okay. Well, that could be the subject of an entire symposium. We've heard very eloquent testimony to the realities of exile. And I think of exile in several ways. One, I think of it in social and historical terms. Puerto Ricans are doubly exiled because if you are, first of all, Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, has been since the Spanish-American War of 1898, and remains so to this day. Secondly, if you're born Puerto Rican in the United States, whether it's from Brooklyn or Orlando, you are exiled even from that colonized island. So it's a double form of exile. And with these multiple forms of exile, you get more and more estranged from yourself. You know less and less who you are. And you get more and more estranged and isolated from others. And sometimes that can be lethal. Sometimes that it can be heartbreaking. And I think now, because I'm in Florida, of another kind of exile, that exile of silence. And silence is broken sometimes only by tragedy. I remember being on the phone with a friend of mine named David Gonzalez, who is a Puerto Rican writer for the New York Times. It was when the story about the Pulse nightclub broke. And there were reports of so many dead. And this was coming out, and we saw over and over and over again, this one has a Spanish surname, that one has a Spanish surname, this one has a Spanish surname. And no one yet had picked that up. The media had overlooked the fact that so many of the victims at the Pulse nightclub massacre were Puerto Rican. And David, being at the New York Times, made sure that it came out. But that story was not emerging because part of that double exile involves silence. You don't know who you are, nobody else knows who you are either. And on top of that, these victims were gay. And speaking of silence, it was not known to many of their family members that they were gay until their bodies were sent back to the island. That's how they came out, in coffins. So this is the price of exile, of double exile. This is the price of silence. All the more reason we must come to know who we are. The most insidious form of censorship is self-censorship. And I congratulate you and your organization for not giving in to self-censorship, not compromising, not saying, oh, we'll just pull out whatever you consider to be objectionable, because that way lies ruin, not only for the artist and the artwork, but for the organization and the community and yourself. So I thank you for that example of your courage.
I'm going to invite Georgia to close us up, but I would personally like to thank you all. And I would like to quote Richard White, that the age of information is just over. Forget the television, the radio, the blurred news. This is the age of the loaves and fishes, and one good word is bread for 1,000. I think your words are bread for thousands and have given us so much today. So I appreciate it. Thank you. It's been an honor. And I'd like to turn it over to Georgia Court.
Thank you, Kate, and thank all of you. This has been a terrific discussion. I really appreciate it. This is the end of our program, but at 7 p.m. this evening in the Keating, Martín and Patricia will be reading their work, and they will be led off by Sarasota County's first ever Youth Poet Laureate, Haley Peace, who will be reading her winning poem. So join us, 7 p.m. at the Keating. There are some tickets still available, I understand, and you can get those at the box office. So thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.